I'd like to say thank you for everyone for coming on board with this wonderful event. We're very excited about this one. I am Lois Gaskin, the president of the Island Story Gatherers. So I'd like to acknowledge the Bunurong people, the traditional custodians of the land the Island Story Gatherers are meeting on tonight, the island called Malau or Phillip Island. We pay our respects to Bunurong elders past and present and to emerging leaders. We extend a very warm welcome to Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders who may be joining us for the event tonight. I also encourage those of you who are listening in other locations to acknowledge the local Aboriginal custodians of the land you are listening from. Now, tonight's event is going to be, I think, very exciting. We've got Tony Birch, and we're talking, well, Chris and Tony are talking about his book, The White Girl, which is just a fabulous book. It was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin this year, and that award was actually won by Tara June Winch with The Yield, and she considers Tony to be a mentor of hers. So, and we also have Chris Flynn, which many of you would know. He's a local author down here on the island, and his latest book, The Mammoth, has been just really well respected, and people have really loved it. So without further ado, I think I'll turn over to Chris and Tony, if he's there somewhere.
Here he comes.
Hi, Tony.
You'd locked me out. You locked me out on the other side of the river, so I'm here.
It's amazing what we can do with technology.
I know.
So I've known Tony. I'm just going to do a bit of an intro for you, Tony. I've known Tony for, I reckon, a decade now, ever since I reviewed his debut novel, The Blood, in Australian Book Review in 2011, I reckon that would have been. I didn't know him at all then, but when I read that book, I thought, who's this? This guy's amazing. I couldn't wait to read more of his work and hopefully get to know him. And I was lucky enough for that to happen. And he's a man that I'm very proud to call my friend. He's been a constant supporter of my work, as well as that of many young writers, especially during his time teaching literature at Melbourne University. He's also been a key mentor and good uncle to younger Indigenous writers like Ellen van Neerven and Tara June Winch. He's written 7 books, short story collections and novels, all of which I've read, and I can't say that about too many writers. I'm just going to list them. They are Shadowboxing, Father's Day, Blood, his first novel, The Promise, Ghost River, Common People, and his latest, The White Girl, which was shortlisted recently for the Miles Franklin Award. He's in fact been shortlisted twice now, which a fact which I believe he has tattooed across his chest. Mm-hmm. In 2017, he was the first Indigenous author to be given the Patrick White Literary Award for services to Australian literature. I believe that he donated that trophy to his beloved Carlton Football Club, just so they could put something in the cabinet. He's a working class hero who's had a bit of an extraordinary life and is one of the top 5 Australian writers alive today. Although, wait a minute, let's not get too carried away. top 20, let's say. He's just retired and has very little to keep him out of mischief, which is why he's talking with us tonight. So please welcome Tony Birch. It looks like it's just us, Tony. I think there's a lot of people watching us, yeah. But it just looks like us, so it's a bit strange. Mate, I interviewed you when your short story collection, Common People, which I've got here, when that came out in 2017. And I just remembered the other day that there's a story in there called The White Girl, mm-hmm. which is about an Aboriginal kid called Noah Sexton who has a crush on the white girl at school. Mm-hmm. I think you were already, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you were already working on this novel at that time when the book came out. Is that right? And how are those stories linked, if at all?
Well, the stories don't link in any specific way, and you are right that there are also in Common People. You'll notice that there's a story, Sissy, who is of course also the 13-year-old girl in The White Girl. And it's interesting, in the story Sissy, it's also about a fair-skinned Aboriginal girl, but growing up in the inner city of Melbourne. The whole idea of the white girl in the White Girl story in Common People, the white girl is a white girl. She's a white Australian who lives in a family with a crazy fundamentalist Christian mother and a policeman father, a lethal combination if you're a young Aboriginal kid. But I actually, quite seriously, I've done this several times. I did it with Blood. Blood was a short story before it was a novel. Is that I do like to, when I think of a title for a work, I take titles very seriously, and they stand for a lot more than the one or two words that are there. And to write a novel, The White Girl, is not to confuse people with the White Girl story. It's in a way to think about the notion of what it is to be a white girl. And in the case of Sissy, she's not white at all. She's an Aboriginal girl. But some people say, well, why would you call it the white girl? It is that perception that she can be made white. And white is a symbol of purity. And that's why I wanted to play with that a little more. And I used to think that, you know, some of my ideas about repetition, but a friend of mine, Ross Gibson, who's a writer and academic in Sydney, he reviewed some of my work once, and he said that he doesn't see it as repetition. He sees it as reiteration, in that you're probably always trying to delve into an issue that you never solve, or that writing right. For me, and I think for most writers, is that we use writing in a way to try and understand the world. And we use writing as a way of trying to make sense of the world, and we never quite do. So we often go back to the same idea, or we go back to think, I think all writers have a common theme in their work, or most writers do. And what it is, it's about us using our writing to try and make sense of a world which is in some ways nonsensical. So in my work, I'm quite happy now and sort of comfortable with the fact that there are constant themes in my work. And I don't feel it's because with myself or other writers that it's sort of laziness, or that you've only got one or two tools in the kit. It's that I think we're fixated with certain ideas. And my ideas, I suppose, Chris, I'm very interested in the notion of redemption. You know, it's the ability to redeem oneself, and of course the inability to do that. And I'm, in regard to Aboriginal storytelling, I'm really interested primarily in the courage and tenacity of Aboriginal people to maintain not only a sense of identity, but a sense of dignity. I regard Odette Brown as an incredibly dignified woman. And that was important to me, that confronting all the racism and violence around her, she keeps her dignity. And people might see that as I don't know, maybe even a conservative trait, but I don't. I see that as the group of Aboriginal women who I grew up amongst, is that they would fight to the death to save their children, but that they would do it in a very dignified way. There's a wonderful poem called Women by the great African-American writer, Alice Walker. And in that poem, there's a beautiful line toward the end of the poem that says, these women have fists as well as hands. And I think it's that sometimes women need to use those fists to protect themselves, to knock down doors and open up doors. But the tenderness of love in the open hand is also there. So it's that full, I think the full story of the emotion of women that I'm really interested in.
Sometimes dignity is all you have left whenever you whenever you are, working class, or, constantly beleaguered. There's always people, trying to put their boot on your neck. Sometimes it's sort of self-respect, humor, and dignity are the only things that you have to cling on to.
Well, I think that's vital. And other people know that my younger brother died quite suddenly about 18 months ago now. And I've written about this now in non-fiction, fiction, and in poetry. I mean, I didn't set out to do that. It became, I think, an emotional necessity. But in one of the pieces that I wrote about my brother, which was based on the days after his death, is that my brother lived in a housing commission estate in Collingwood, and he died at home. And my mother had always maintained a really clean house for him. She cleaned his house when she could, and when she couldn't, she got in home help. So his house was well kept. But when he died and all the furniture was taken out, my younger sister and my older sister went around and scrubbed the house clean. And I said to my younger sister, Tracy, you don't need to do this. Yeah, you don't need to do this. The commission will come in, but we will leave it clean enough. And she said, but that's what we are. This is who we are. And the notion for her and my older sister would be that we wouldn't want anyone to go in there and say, oh, someone's left this unclean. And there's a sort of dignity in that when you spend your life being told that you're not clean or that your community is unclean for, say, to justify the removal of children, as is the case with the white girl, my mother, my grandmother and my sisters and myself, we have a real sense of, it's a very conservative word again, to be house proud. We're not doing it for outsiders. We're not doing it because we want the state to approve of us. We're doing it because we're not dirty. And it's important for us to live a life that exemplifies that. So we would never want to become what the state has historically determined us to be. And it might seem odd, but for us to keep our house clean and tidy is to defy that negative stereotype.
That's right. There's a real defiance in that act of making sure that you are well presented, that your house is clean. I have that same thing, and it's a bit of a working class thing too, where you just don't want someone to think that you're scum. You want them to believe that you are greater than the station that you've been given in life.
Yeah, I was at a conference in Perth a couple of years ago, all Indigenous presenters, and I met a wonderful young guy from Broome who was a photographer, and he was telling me that, and his photographs are just beautiful, and again, of really dignified community members, and a lot of young kids around Broome, Aboriginal kids, said, oh, can you take our photo? And he said, yeah, I'd love to. So they all turned up at his studio, and he said they were, look really scruffy. He said, go home. Go home and have a shower. Put your best shirt on, And he said, I had this sense I wanted them to, and those beautiful, I don't know if you've ever seen them, and I think if there are any Aboriginal people in the audience tonight, they'll know this, that they're remarkable. There are two ways to think about studio portraits of Aboriginal people historically. One of the demeaning studio portraits where white fellas would get Aboriginal people, put all sort of so-called tribal paraphernalia around them, with no concern whether it was culturally appropriate. In other words, a woman's basket could be placed on the floor next to a man, etc. All of these abuses. And they would take people out of their everyday life and put them in this sort of context of the primitive or whatever. But there's also a great history of studio portraiture of people of colour where people choose to go to a photographic studio with their best Sunday suit on, with their outfit they wear to church, or with because they want to say, not that it's not about assimilating, this is who we are, and we are a dignified people. And I think, most Aboriginal people are constantly aware of surveillance. We're constantly aware of how outsiders see us, and the way that we present ourselves to the world is to say whatever stereotype you want to construct around us, we're not going to we're not going to reflect that. We're going to make sure we don't reflect that. And it's not a conservatism. It is a genuine sense of claiming autonomy and claiming your authority as a person, rather than have your identity framed for you by a racist ideology.
Sometimes, no matter what you do, though, people are still going to believe whatever they want to believe. And harking back to that short story, The White Girl, when it's a really memorable story for me, because Noah goes around to Heather's house and her mother really mollycoddles him, and she even gives him a bath because she thinks he's not clean enough. And I think you told me one time that something kind of similar happened to you. You were taken away from your family on a holiday, but it was a really shitty holiday to Doncaster or something from Fitzroy. Please don't. The people, there could be some from Doncaster in the audience, and I know Phillip Island's a long way, but they'll come looking for you. The people in Doncaster hold a grudge. It was actually in Rosanna. No, I'm sure there's no one from Rosanna Rosanna people don't
do these sort of events.
No, they're not on Zoom.
It actually relates quite specifically, by the way, to the story Sissy in Common People. So that when I was a young child, I was only 6 years of age, the Catholic Church in Fitzroy, it was related to a place called the House of Welcome, which is a bit of an oxymoron at the time. I mean, it does good work now. But we were billeted to middle class and well-off Catholic families for a summer holiday. And my brother and sister had actually gone on a holiday to Corryong, which is on the New South Wales Victorian border, and they'd gone in an aeroplane, which was remarkable. It'd be like saying to a kid in Fitzroy, would you like to go to the moon tomorrow? You know, it was that outlandish. And I said to my mum, look, I want to go on one of these holidays. And so the next year I was billeted to a family in Rosanna, a place I'd never heard of. And I thought, well, it could be in New South Wales, possibly Queensland, palm trees, ocean. And a woman came to pick me up in a little Morris Minor, and as much as a stereotype this sounds, she was it. She had a twin set on, a hat, a little box hat and some pearls. And what was interesting, when she got out of the car, she couldn't step onto the footpath. She wouldn't come too close to the house. And I got in the car with my cardboard suitcase and we drove down Brunswick Street. We drove up Heidelberg Road, and then we drove into a suburban street in Rosanna, and we pulled up outside a triple front cream brick veneer. And I thought, well, we must be picking up some other kids to go to the airport, you know.
On the way to the airport, yeah.
Yeah, and she just said, oh, come, we're here. And I thought, what do you mean we're here? So they took me into the house, and then they opened my cardboard suitcase and saw my hand-me-downs, which would have been given to me by my older brother. They took the suitcase out into the yard, put it in the incinerator, put petrol on it, and set fire to my clothes and suitcase. Then they gave me their hand-me-downs from the woman's son. His name was Harold. I'll never forget Harold, which were much better than my hand-me-downs, by the way. And then the next day they took me to a dentist and had all my teeth taken out, all my back teeth, which I just got my second teeth. So I've never had back teeth since then. So, I suffer a piece of steak since the age of 7. So they had all my teeth taken out. And then I was only supposed to stay for a week. They literally didn't return me to my mother. And then it was clear that they thought, well, we'll just keep him. He's a funny kid. He keeps Harold company. He could be like a mascot in Rosanna or something.
He can't eat steak, so he'll be cheap to keep. Yeah,
they were going to keep me. And it wasn't until my mother rang up and was very forceful and then said to my dad, you got to go and get him. So my dad and a couple of his mates who were pissed at the Builders Arms Hotel in Fitzroy got into a car and drove out to Rosanna. And of course, when they saw 3 Aboriginal men on the doorstep, they said, take him, please take him and get back to the inner city. And what was so funny is that when I knew I was going and I was in the bedroom I've been sleeping in, I just loaded all these Harold's clothes into a bag. And I'll never forget when I got home, my older brother and my sister, rather than say, oh, you're back, you've been saved, they just grabbed the bag off me and within 5 minutes were wearing Harold's clothes around the house. So, I mean, it's hilarious and it's extremely traumatic. So when I think about it, when I was writing the story Sissy, I was going to write what I've just told you, but anyone who reads that story knows that it ends with the girl not getting in the car, running and not getting in the car. And as much as I love the humor of the story, when I tried to write it as fiction, I actually got really upset and I couldn't write it. It was actually really traumatic to think about writing it. So I decided to write a story about a girl who was a surrogate for me, but I suppose what we might call a happy ending story, a story where she defies the woman who tries to get her in the car. So it's a mild story, of course, in relationship to what happened to tens of thousands of Aboriginal kids being taken from family. But it's indicative. I would suggest that what is common in all these stories is that the fact that the state and a middle-class white woman simply thinks that she can do this, that she can take a child who's not hers and she can burn his clothes, she can have his teeth taken out because he doesn't have any rights. And it's a bit like the woman who gives the boy, the bath in the short story, The White Girl, is that my job is to purify these, half castes, whatever, and that their calling of salvation and saving is not ever brought into question. So that woman would not have questioned that she might not have the right to do that. And she is in fact reflective of Sergeant Lowe in The White Girl, the very nasty policeman, in the sense he reflects a history of white administrators, guardians, protectors of Aborigines, police, bureaucrats, a whole sector of that removal industry who would never ever have felt that what they were doing was not what they wanted to do or could do or should do. So people have often asked me about that policeman, and I try to make an important point as a historian who did a lot of work looking at government documents about these relationships. I could read to you incredibly traumatic testimonies of Aboriginal women I know, of big Victorian families I know, heartbreaking letters writing to police and to government officials, pleading to have their children returned to them. And the responses from the bureaucrats and police are heartless. They recognise the woman's pain, but they will say, but this is for the good of the child, so therefore we cannot submit to your request to have your own child returned to you. So it's not that they don't believe that Aboriginal women experience pain and suffering, it's that they believe that the pain and suffering that a mother experiences is to them not as important as their need to save the child, which is incredibly callous.
And I mean, you spoke about Sergeant Lowe in The White Girl, and obviously he's the new copper who comes to town to sort of install himself as the custodian and guardian of the local mob, which has alarming consequences for young Sissy, who is the other Sissy that is in The White Girl. He's a really disturbing character, because not only does he see himself as the person who is supposed to do this, he seems to almost revel in it and enjoy it.
Yeah, and I would firmly state that his psyche, or his approach to this, is reflective of a very common experience amongst police that I followed. In other words, I followed their own writing, and that they do believe that it is their, and for some of them it's religious, their God-given right to save children, and I use save, of course, in inverted commas. But also, I think more disturbing than that, Chris, is that they do have an attraction to power to an almost pathological degree. And it's important to note in this book, and I think in the experiences of many Aboriginal people in the second half of the 20th century, and of course into the current day, is that if you live in a small or regional town as an Aboriginal person in the 1960s, your liberty, or even your limited liberty, is dependent on the goodwill of the local policeman. And one of the things that we know is that in some instances, in some towns, coppers and blackfellas got on pretty well. Yeah, they might play in the same football team. We know, I mean, it's not a harmonious sort of multicultural relationship, but if the local copper wasn't a bad bloke and he'd met Aboriginal people and got along with them, Aboriginal people could live within that town, within that jurisdiction, with a relative sense of freedom. Now, that had to be negotiated, of course, and it would be limited, but that's interesting, because if you had a policeman who was not like that, or a policeman who saw his position of power as something that he could abuse and use to control people, Aboriginal people had no sense of when their rights would be taken away. So in other words, they could exist with a sense of freedom one day, and then at a whim of the policeman who, maybe got up with a hangover, or maybe had a bad day, he could literally change their lives within a moment. And in those situations, it's very precarious, because not only is the policeman an unpredictable person, for an Aboriginal person, that unpredictability creates it disables them, because they're not sure how to negotiate, how to relate. Now, we know that in Odette's case, she knows how to play Bill Shea. She knows him, and partly because she can really shame Bill Shea because she's known him since childhood. She finds out very quickly that the new sergeant is not a person that she has any ability to negotiate with. And when she goes to the police station and tries to concoct the story of needing to leave the town to go and visit a sick relative, now I would imagine that that sort of storytelling would be something she's probably rehearsed over the years and knew when and how to apply it with someone like Shea. It just doesn't cut anything with this new copper because he's not interested in her as a human being. He's not interested in her as a person. And that's when she makes the immediate and sudden decision to leave the town. So I know when I created her, I was thinking about the way that, in particular, my mum and my nan has spent their whole lives in a way having to concoct an image and a story and a performance to suit a relationship with a bureaucrat. So my mum would know which copper she could get up in their face and say, you know, you let my son out of that cell, he's coming home with me now. And that would work. And with another policeman, she'd have to defer to him and in a way convince him that he is in a position of power and plead with him in a way that might allow her to negotiate. But my mother and grandmother would also say that there are some people that you simply had no ability to influence because they were not interested in your story and they weren't interested in the consequences of their actions in the sense of how it would negatively impact on you. And Lo is that sort of person. It's why, and I mean, this is not giving away an important ending. There was an idea that I would kill Sergeant Lowe, or one of my characters would, or I mean, through me, but the whole issue about Sergeant Lowe is that Millie Khan, who's a wonderful character in the novel, says he's out there. He's still out there because I wanted that to be the case because these men, they are out there. They're always going to be out there. And for Aboriginal people, there is never a time in our lives where we could live in complete safety because there are people like Sergeant Lowe who will always be there. And he's almost like a ghostly, menacing presence by the end of the novel. But I think that was the appropriate way to finish with him, that you could never be free of someone who had such a menacing attitude towards Aboriginal people and someone who was prepared to take away the liberty of a girl and punish her grandmother with no sense of emotion.
And getting rid of him wouldn't solve the problem because the idea of him still endures and still endures today. And it's kind of interesting seeing the relationship between Aboriginal people and the police and authority in the book, because I'm sure you've been fascinated to notice that everyone's now needing travel permits and exemptions to travel within Australia because of COVID. But those sort of travel permits and exemptions, they were obviously in place for Aboriginal Australians for a very long time. And I think they maybe still are in some areas, are they?
Well, of course they are. They are in the Northern Territory under the intervention very strictly. And while they mightn't be in place formally in other parts of Australia, again, a local person's freedom still is in a way influenced heavily by their relationship with authority. I think though that you touch on something that's really important in that several people, and in fact it was one of my adult daughters, oh actually they're all adults now, I forget how quickly they grow, but one of my 4 daughters, Siobhan, she in an exchange recently, she launched the White Girl actually. She's made 2 observations. She said to me, well, the way people are now being forced to have limited movement, limited freedom of movement, the need to get permits, she said maybe people may have some sense of what it is to be an Aboriginal person in 20th century Australia, because that's the life for most Aboriginal people. That, in Victoria, when the infamous so-called Half-Caste Act was introduced in 1886, I mean, it literally restricted some people to a mission for the rest of their life and refused entry to the mission to younger Aboriginal people. So it literally cut off families completely, and those families technically were not allowed to see each other again. So yeah, I think that there are many. I mean, I know that she's in the crowd tonight, Melissa Lukashenko. I was reading her essay in The Guardian over recent days, talking about, you know, what a crazy year we're experiencing. And I know in Melissa's piece, she talks about not only what Aboriginal people have gone through historically, but the incredible tenacity of Aboriginal people to survive this. So and I think partly this is Melissa Lukashenko's point, we're well equipped
to deal with the current situation. Yeah.
We've got a good pedigree of sort of facing adversity, and it is, you know, it's humorous to think about, like, we can teach you something, but at a very serious level, one of the issues that drove the book was, you know, as people may know, I did a PhD in history, and I had taught Aboriginal and Australian history at Melbourne University for about 6 years before I taught writing. And a lot of my research is looking at various forms of Aborigines acts and controls. And I think that one of the things that I discovered very early, which complemented what I knew through oral and family history, is that Aboriginal women living on reserves and missions, not only are they the backbone of community, is that they were the generation of women, in the case that I was looking at in the 20th century, who really overcame those restrictions and remarkably turned places of incarceration, namely a government reserve or religious mission, into great centres of Aboriginal political activism. So it's not surprising that in Victoria, places like Framingham Reserve or Lake Tyers Reserve are great places of political resurgence. It's the case of places like Cherbourg Mission, places like Palm Island. These are places where Aboriginal people are exiled, where Aboriginal people are placed under terribly authoritative control, and yet they become centres of political renaissance, of cultural renaissance. And I think it goes to my point, and a point that Melissa's work was dealing with, is that we can turn both states and circumstances of adversity into remarkable sites of energy. And I think I think Aboriginal people can adapt. And when I say adapt, I don't mean assimilate, adapt any situation to a situation of fighting for autonomy and authority. And in the case of, sorry, that's my phone. In the case of Odette Brown, her whole life is to negotiate her autonomy, to negotiate her protection of Sissi, and she has to be able to do that in a very ingenious way. So she knows when she needs to defer, she knows when she needs to step up. And in the case when she goes to the farmhouse after she finally realises the true story of what happened to her daughter Lila, she knows it's time to get it on, you know, to really, there's nothing left but her ferocity. And I actually love writing that scene for all the dignity, all the poise that she has. That moment in Odette's life, all of that is just cast aside, and she has a level of anger and energy that drives her forward. And sometimes that's the way that Aboriginal people have to act. So I wouldn't want people to consider that, you know, Aboriginal women are always simply trying to be polite, because in the case of my again, thinking of my grandmother, is that she could do all that, and if she needed to stand up and shape up and literally fight with her fists to save her children and grandchildren, she did that as well.
I mean, people are, you'd hope, generally aware of the stolen generation and what that meant, but what did it mean for Aboriginal girls and young women? It seems like they were owned by the state, not just physically, but also sexually and spiritually.
Well, you're completely right. So there are, the word might sound wrong, but I'll explain it. There are practical reasons and there are psychological and political reasons. Leanne Simpson, who's a wonderful scholar from Turtle Island, people may know it as Canada, in one of her seminal articles, and she's an Indigenous scholar who I've followed very closely, she wrote a very simple but effective sentence in one of her articles where she said, and this is in relationship to colonial invasion, of course, in North America, get to the land, they had to take the women and children. And that statement doesn't mean take them and imprison them, take them and kill them, although both those terrible crimes occurred. She is talking about the reproductive control of women, because your ability to control the reproductive autonomy of an Indigenous woman is also an attempt to control the identity, the formation of identity of the children that a woman will have. So that is one issue. So part of the legislative measures were quite deliberately framed to imprison the bodies of Aboriginal women, to try and determine who those women will have children with, and to control their reproductive ability. The other one, though, I think it's a much more spiritual, metaphysical and psychological issue, is I don't think we can separate the violence of land and the rape of land and country from the rape and violence against women. So if you look at the colonial record, it's so apparent that the destruction of land and the destruction of the body of women go hand in hand. So that in parts of Western District of Victoria, where I've done a lot of my research, the horrific crimes against women occur at the same time of the horrific crimes against against ecologies, which of course are ongoing. So if we look at the contemporary issue of Black Lives Matter, or I'd rather say Aboriginal Lives Matter in the Australian context, we're dealing with a situation today in 2020 where the violence against Aboriginal women is constant. It's shocking, and the worst aspect of that is it's tolerated, it's accepted. And as much as we might see, thankfully, a lot of people out in the streets protesting about this violence, when you go to basics and think, well, what are the actual outcomes? So when you think, I'm thinking of the death of a woman I know, her family, who I'm not going to name here, is that when I think of the death of this woman and the outcome for that family, both in a legal sense, in the sense of how the medical fraternity were involved, the court system, is that the only conclusion that you can reach is this woman's life was had no substantial value to those institutions. And I think that's a shocking crime, but it's also important to recognise it, because if we're at a state where we still believe it's tolerable to do such violence against an Aboriginal woman, what does that say about the supposed advancement of a colonial idea of conquest? Because it indicates to me that we still have a long way to go before we can say that there is a moment of maturity in the nation where things are going to change fundamentally.
Well, I guess we live in a time where colonialism is a concept that's very linked to the past, but I often wonder if it's just still an ongoing project that has never really ended. Well,
look, and it's not. I'm not making a political point to say that. I mean, it is the case. So that I think one of the things that I think we could consider, all of us, because I don't want to, I don't want to reflect a position of hopelessness. I think one of the things that maybe your audience would be interested in is that, say, the areas that I'm interested in. So my job that I've just left is 5 years working in what we might call climate justice and issues around climate change. If we're thinking also now about collaboration or cooperation around ending the death of Aboriginal people in custody, what we see in Australia is actually very productive relationships often occurring at a grassroots level, not just within Aboriginal communities, but between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people. So the Wangan and Jagalingou struggle in southern Queensland, it's interesting that Murray Johnson and Adrian Barragubba, in all of their public talks, they've actually called on non-Aboriginal people to help the cause, to work with them, because they can't win that struggle on their own. And there have been some really wonderful collaborative outcomes at a local level. In the same case of ecological work I've looked at great localised environmental protection projects, water protection projects, where Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people work very effectively together. What's interesting is as that tries to trickle up and become something beyond the grassroots and local, it gets pushed back. There's always a pushback against this. And I think it's because once you start to trickle up into mainstream society, which is looking at, say, a broader application of these relationships, I think there is a fear. And that fear is that actually these forces of cooperation, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal people working together, could force fundamental change, and there are people who don't want that fundamental change to take place. In fact, I think for some people, it's still very dangerous to consider that we could shift the psyche of the nation into a genuine post-colonial state, and there are a lot of forces put in place literally to stop that happening. And I could point to them, I don't want to bore people, but I could point to them in relationship to the cessation of projects because governments suddenly withdraw funding, interventions that don't allow the projects to grow. And to me, they're deliberate acts to ensure that the energy of these cooperative ventures don't grow any bigger.
There's been a massive surge of interest, though, from the wider community in black writing recently. Obviously, Melissa's book, and Tara winning the Miles Franklin. So that's two Aboriginal women winning the Miles Franklin in successive years.
Shocking.
It's shocking, you know. And I mean, when are you going to win it instead of just being a constant runner-up?
No. Before you go on, I need to intervene. I can tell you this now, Chris Flynn. I made shortlists look great. I give shortlists great street cred, and I'm happy to do that year in, year out. I'm happy with that. You know,
you give great shortlist. Well, but there's, you know, Melissa's book, Tara's book, Bruce's book, Dark Emu is obviously one of the, you know, almost a shock bestseller in the past year. It's sold absolutely gangbusters. Do you think that books written by Aboriginal Australians are helping the wider community get to grips a little bit with some of the, not only the country's shocking past, but this idea of collaboration and sort of breaking that hold that colonialism has on us, but just by through ideas?
Look, you would hope so, and I do think so. So again, I think it's important to be hopeful. Another great Aboriginal writer, Alexis Wright, who's such a hero of mine and a good friend of mine. She wrote a wonderful essay in Meanjin in 2016, which is about who can tell, whose story. And it wasn't it's not an article about censorship. In fact, it's an article about the vitality of us as Aboriginal people, not only owning our own story, but being able to tell it, to reproduce it for our community and wider dissemination. And what Alexis' essay is a very generous offering to non-Aboriginal people. And in other words, to say, these are our stories. We need to be in control of them. We want to share them. We want to articulate them. We want you to read them because we believe that way you will become better informed about us and will become better informed about each other. So I would say clearly that the more people that are reading our stories, I believe in the power of story. I believe in the power of narrative. Clearly, I think those stories are having a major impact. I know that a lot of our books are being taught at both for the secondary and tertiary level. I mean, Bruce Pascoe is being taught at prep, he's Dark Emu for juniors. He'll have Dark Emu for prenatal, So all of our books are being taught, and I go to schools regularly where people were already studying the white girl, and Ellen Van Nerven, they're reading Ellen's work, Tara's work, they're reading Melissa's work, Kim Scott's work. So I think that does have an impact. How far that penetrates, again, I don't know, because there are forces beyond the goodwill of schools and teachers who prohibit that change. What I'd say, though, in relationship to that, is that I want to make a call out for all of those writers that you mentioned, but also many others that came before us, like Ujaru, who, were like sort of lone soldiers, taking up the struggle of Aboriginal writing on their own, and Torres Strait Islander writing as well. And we're following in the footsteps of these heroic people. But one of the things I'd say that's changed in the last decade, I used to turn up at a writers' festival 10 years ago, and there'll be no other Aboriginal writers there, and very few Aboriginal people in the audience. You were never interviewed by an Aboriginal person. Not that it's essential. You're a brilliant interviewer. I've always wanted to be interviewed by someone from Belfast. And you would be on your own and you felt like you're a barely moving target. When I go to writers' festivals now, we're like a travelling circus of blackfellas who catch up often just at the festival circuit. We're very interested in each other's work. We watch each other's back, but we also know that there is a great interest in our work from audiences. And what I've say, this is important, I've detected a change from some of the issues that I raise. 10 years ago, you would sense hostility in the crowd. Right. At a very wide level, and you'd find your questions turn into a battle, you know, people throwing tomatoes at you, and now there's still that element of right-wing populism will always be there, but I would say that I find I have very informed and interested audiences, so I enjoy that discussion, and I tend to come away from sessions now that I'm either the presenter or that, you know, like I know that, yeah, if Melissa or Alan have been at festivals, we go to each other's events, and I've been in the crowds at their events and thought, you know, the crowd really appreciates these writers, or more of the crowd increasingly appreciates this writer. So we don't have to go to festivals and just fight endless battles to defend ourselves. We're now going to festivals where I think there's a genuine appreciation for our work.
Melissa was down here at the festival on the island last year. And I interviewed her, and she did one of the funniest things I've ever seen to totally disarm the crowd. She said, "Oh, I'm going to sing a song to welcome you to my country." And the room was totally silent in respect. And she sort of got the mic, closed her eyes, and then started singing the theme tune to Neighbours.
Yeah. Well, it would have disarmed me as well.
Hey, Tony, you've been heavily involved in activism your whole life, and quite a lot recently in particular. What would you like to see happen over, say, the next 20 years, other than Carlton winning the grand final? But, you know, let's be realistic. Yeah,
well, I was going to say me winning the Miles Franklin Award, but I'll say let's be realistic.
Let's be realistic.
Let's be realistic. No, that would be good. I've got 2 books coming out next year, neither of which can win the Miles Franklin because one's poetry and one's short story. But I'm actually writing a novel now, so I think we should have a good plan in place that I win the Miles Franklin in 2023 and Carlton win the premiership, and I don't care what happens in the rest of the world in 20 years. Look, I think I was talking to a friend of mine today over at an event we're doing this week, and he said that one of the questions, my dog's just gone crazy, one of the questions he was going to ask me was, am I optimistic or pessimistic? And I'm neither. And one of the things I said to him, and this goes back, by the way, to thinking about someone like Odette Brown, or thinking about these mighty Aboriginal women who led the struggle on reserves and missions. I'm not trying to deflect or ignore your question, but I couldn't answer it and to say, well, this is what I'd like to see. I'll give a wish list in a second. But in regard to my own activism or my own writing, my attitude is I've got to keep doing the work. Keep doing the writing, keep talking to people, keep connecting up with younger blackfellas and doing stuff, because I don't know that there's nothing else I can do. So in other words, if I were pessimistic and felt beaten, that's it, you're gone. Once you feel that, you'd be gone. So my feeling is just keep doing what I'm doing. If I can be of help to people, be of help. If my writing engages people with the issues, do that. So I just think just do the work and hope that some of it has traction. I suppose I'm like all of those people at my age. When you ask the question, well, in 20 years, my granddaughter will be 24, my grandson will be 22, and my in-womb grandson, who's going to be born in London, believe it or not, Chris, which I know fills both of us with horror, that he'll be a little Englishman.
Oh, no.
Charlie, is that, he'll be 21. So I would hope that as young adults, as young Aboriginal people, that they can not only look back to those who went before and be very proud of them, but also just to be able to speak and live and act in a way that they're given respect. And I think the generation of young Aboriginal people today who are at the forefront of activism or in the arts, they're still struggling and fighting to gain respect. And while again there are great allies or great non-Aboriginal people who they work with who do give that respect, they still face some of the great negativities that plagued the generations that went before them. So I would like to hope for that generation that they don't have to continually defend who they are, that they don't have to go into battle over every issue. I mean, it's very tiring to have to battle. I said in an interview with The Guardian when this book came out, two things. One is that I've never met an Aboriginal family or person whose lives weren't touched by the stolen generations history. So in other words, I don't know of an Aboriginal family that haven't lost family members to imprisonment, to incarceration, to death, to being lost and never found again. Never. I don't know of any family. And I think for most Aboriginal people, and I think this is what non-Aboriginal people don't understand, and I say this in a way to defend people because they can't understand this experience. As an Aboriginal person, your life is compromised every day. Every day you have to negotiate the world as an Aboriginal person and you're conscious of that. And it comes up in ways that people often can't even comprehend. I've been dealing with an issue over the last couple of weeks around racism in sport, giving advice to a remarkably courageous man. And a few of us have been talking to him. And one of the things that he has articulated is that he's not interested in the fact that you might be called a racist term on the football field, from another player or over the fence, because a lot of that has been dealt with. He's interested in the fact when you go into your workplace, in his case, a football club, where your daily interactions with people, which are not about what language you use, but about how you socially engage with a person, is he feels to continually put him back in his place, to suggest to him that there is something different about him. And having to negotiate that every day is incredibly difficult for people. And I've found, to my surprise, that I've worked in really tough environments. I worked in a meat works. I went to very tough schools. I found the tertiary sector not only the most difficult to deal with, sometimes the most racist institutions I've dealt with, and no one ever called me an abo once. It's about how people perceive you to be. So there are always people, and I was a university professor by the time that I retired, being patronised and being treated as a child when you're a 60-year-old man who's got every accolade that any other person has, and then some for most of us. Afterward, and still people treat you in a really patronising way as a man or a woman. It's very hard to come to terms with, because you've only got two choices. One is to suck it up in a way, or two is to tell someone to get stuffed, and that just makes the situation worse for yourself.
I think there's probably a lot of work still to be done and by the wider community to stop treating Aboriginal people as the other, as somehow a separate entity.
Or, I mean, it's a weird thing, or to exoticize you in a way that also takes away the reality of being a person. And this is quite disturbing, and it may, there are some white people you meet who actually are the opposite. In a way, you could say anything to them. You could, and they won't react, and they'll say, "Oh, look, we've treated you so badly. Of course, that we understand if you think that you need to, savage us every day." And that's terrible, because that's not a relationship. And when people were continually apologising to me for the sins of white society, I say, please stop. I can't have a relationship with you as a person if it's based on your guilt. I understand what might motivate it, and what we call good intentions, but we can't have a relationship if it's determined by your guilt. That's another issue that you have to deal with. I want to deal with someone, and in a way, Chris, we're just talking about dealing with someone on an equal footing. And I mean, I I think it's interesting, and I don't want to pump your tires up too much. You've had too much good coverage of your great novel, Mammoth. But meeting you 10 years ago, I think one of the great things was that your outsider perspective of both coming from another country, but also coming from an interesting experience of what we call the Troubles in Northern Ireland. It gave you both a perspective as an outsider, so you weren't implicated in that same way, but also you come with your own history, which is about segregation, which is about people's visceral prejudices against each other. That was, for me, really refreshing. And I think it's interesting that it's hard for white Australia to have that, what we might call experience and knowledge, because everyone is implicated of what's happened here, but also they don't have anything to measure it against. So I'm not suggesting that in our conversations you ever said, well, what happened in Northern Ireland is like what happened here. But I think what you understand from growing up in Northern Ireland that is relative here is that people's histories of prejudice and histories of hatred and histories of animosity create the most illogical, irrational thoughts in people. And it's hard for sometimes to penetrate that irrationality, so that, it's hard. I'm a great believer in socialization. I think most instances, if you don't know anyone as you said, as only the other, you can break a lot of those oppositions down by actually meeting people, interacting with them. But as you would well know, I could sit an Aboriginal woman down at this table and a Pauline Hanson, or well, not a Pauline Hanson, I'm going beyond the pale now, but a racist, and say, look, this is a woman. This is a wonderful woman. She's a writer. She has family. She has children. And that person, it will still not penetrate their psyche that woman needs to be treated with dignity. And you can't overcome that. That's the terrible legacy of racism, that there are some instances in which you will never change people's mind, and you can't penetrate their psyche because it's welded. They're wired. It's wired into them.
It's so endemic that it's immovable. Yeah.
And those people need to be literally, I was going to say put aside, but I'm not one for capital punishment. Those people can never be given positions of responsibility. And this is the issue. When people in government, in schools, in teachers, if there are people like this working in our institutions, they cannot be in those institutions. They have to be taken out, and they cannot be given positions where they have authority over other people's lives, because they are incredibly damaging people.
We'll finish up soon, but you've told me before that you're quite wary of historical fiction, and yet here you are with a book that's set 60 years ago. So I guess it's historical fiction. But what are your reservations in going further back in your work? I mean, would you ever be tempted to write a novel set during the 1800s?
Well, firstly, I'm full of contradictions and hypocrisies. If I ever said that, I probably just made it up because I thought Chris would be impressed by this, because I don't think Chris likes it. No, I think it's interesting. I actually think this sounds weird. I think there is great historical fiction, and probably the first thing to do is when you're writing a novel, which is historical fiction, is get that idea out of your head and think of, as I've always said, the work's the only thing that matters. So in other words, that primarily just focus on story, focus on character. Historical fiction that fails for me, I suppose, does two things. One is at a sort of shallow level, and that is what I call product placement. I think over-researched historical fiction is problematic in that people get fixated with trying to recreate the authenticity of the time. And when I talk creative writing, I used to say to students, if you're writing historical fiction, we don't want a photograph, we want an impressionist painting. In other words, you don't need to be historically accurate. I mean, obviously you don't put a mobile phone in a 19th century novel, but it's about, you want to create the atmosphere of the period. You want to create the impression of the period, because a good reader and good writing will do that very effectively. That's the first thing. I think historical fiction is, and particularly its relationship to the nation is incredibly fixated with imagery and incredibly fixated with either underpinning an image of what I might call nationalism or completely destroying it. And I think good historical fiction, in other words, is more subtle in that sense. I suppose to counter your statement of my hypocrisy and irrationality is that because I was born before this novel was set, I didn't think it was historical fiction because I don't think of myself as a historical artifact. So, I mean, when I was writing this set in early 1960, I was alive, Chris. So I was able to draw on personal childhood experience. So, yeah, I think maybe that to counter what I've just said in regard to Aboriginal people, Kim Scott has written remarkably powerful historical fiction. I know she's been mentioned so many times, she should have been on the show. Melissa Lukashenko, I think, is writing a historical novel at the moment set in 1970. Really? So I have great faith in that outcome. I think Aboriginal people have written great historical fiction. And I think that great historical fiction, or historical fiction that works effectively, it is about, I think, something quite nuanced and not wanting to make any, because when people think history, people often want to make sort of grand claims. What's so interesting about Aboriginal history and Aboriginal fiction looking at history, it's quite unique in that Aboriginal writers who deal with a historical period are actually writing that story as in a commercial part for the first time. They're not rewriting a story. In other words, if you did a novel set in the First World War, well, we know that First World War novels and stories have been told ad nauseum. Whereas if you're looking at a 19th century novel that, say, focused on an Aboriginal woman living autonomously or living on a mission, how few of those stories do we know? Very few, if any. So if an Aboriginal writer is tackling that period, they're the pioneers of that period. So it's in other words, I'd see it as a different, it's a different construction, and the outcome is very different. So I think that's a part of our, if we accept it, I'm not saying we have to, the Aboriginal writers, filmmakers, artists, any Aboriginal person making story now, I think many of us would say we have a responsibility to recover the stories of those who came before us because their stories were repressed and lost. And I know we've got to finish, but maybe a good point to finish on, because this is relative. The German legal scholar and novelist Bernhard Schlink, who people will know wrote the novel The Reader.
The Reader, yeah.
He wrote a great series of essays called Guilt About the Past. And he wrote an essay in that called Stories About the Past. And he said the greatest indignity we can do to a group of people is not people who we have repressed, the people who we have, acted violently towards, to not allow those people to tell their own story is a great indignity. And I think that what the Aboriginal arts cohort, what we're doing is we're taking on a responsibility. So in my case with Odette Brown, I wanted to tell a story that has not been told, that has been repressed, that has been lost, that has been denied, and to say this is a powerful moment we all need to learn from. And I think a lot of Aboriginal writers are doing the same thing, whether they're dealing with contemporary fiction or whether they're dealing with moments of history. So it's actually, I will now change my tune completely, Chris, and end by saying that historical fiction is remarkably important.
Is it true that you're thinking of moving to the island now you've retired? You can walk your dog on the beach every day here and we're COVID free. Well,
to be quite honest, I mean, you might find this amusing, but living in Carlton, not being able to go anywhere except to go for a run around Princes Park, everyone else has put on weight during COVID. I've lost about 4 kilos because I just get out every opportunity I can and just keep running around the park. I would love to move to Phillip Island, not because of the penguins. And I've always wondered if those penguins are real penguins or stuffed penguins, but that's another story. I would move to the island, but as you would know, and anyone who's from Victoria would know, to get to Phillip Island, I have to cross the Birrarung, or what people know as the Yarra River. And I did apply for a passport to move to the southeastern side of Melbourne. And once they saw that I'd spent all my life in the inner city and that I had a minor criminal record, I was denied a passport. So I can't even come to visit you, Chris, let alone reside on the island. So we're just going to have to do this until you can come up to the dark alleys of the inner city again and you know, sort of try your luck.
Well, I do always seem to be the one who's driving up to visit you, so I
don't
never
have
understood.
a car. I don't drive.
Yeah, right. Okay. There's always an excuse, isn't there? So is there a more down-to-earth, unpretentious, gifted and modest author in Australia than Tony Birch? Probably not. I would say to people—
I can answer that. Definitely not.
Definitely not. Definitely not more modest. So check out his latest book, The White Girl, shortlisted for the Miles Franklin. Didn't win, but still very good.
But we had a good winner.
Yeah, we had a good winner. I would also recommend Common People and The Promise, if you like short stories. Or if you're more into novels, Ghost River and Blood are good ones to check out. All of Tony's books are available at Turn the Page Bookshop here in Cowes. Lois Gaskin, who we saw at the top of the event, runs the shop, and here she comes back on the screen. So thank you very much for joining us, Tony. It is not true what they say about you.
Some of it. Thank you very much. And look, quite sincerely, I want to thank both of you, Lois and Chris, for— I know it's been really difficult times with the lockdown, and I did I put some notices up on Facebook, and my daughter put it up on Instagram about the event, because I absolutely think it's vital that we as writers and readers and audience support festivals like yours. You're punching above your weight in the sense of the great writers that you've had at your festival. And I think it's remarkable that you've had the audacity to continue with this during a really difficult time. And I think it's a great testament to people in the arts community more generally, who are getting hammered at the moment, getting little support from government, under great financial stress, that people are just continuing to do the best that they can. And it's why I wouldn't hesitate to have the conversation. And I would say to all of the audience listening tonight is that it's vital for us to support other writers. It's vital for us as readers to support bookshops like Lois's bookshop. And quite seriously, I think when freedom is finally granted to us, I think it's incumbent on us to celebrate that freedom by visiting bookshops like Lois, by catching up with our writing friends. And I think that what lockdown has done for me, it has really, it's brought to the fore what I love and value. And of course, for me, first and foremost, that's my family, my children and grandchildren, my partner and extended family. But I miss people like you. I miss catching up with friends. I was doing a lot of festival events this year, and it was more that there was great Aboriginal friends that I was going to catch up with at those festivals, and I really miss that. I miss audiences at local festivals. Audiences at local festivals are always really well-read people, really engaging, and I love going to small festivals where, if you go down for the weekend, by the end of the weekend, you know everyone. And I really miss that intimacy. So I'll certainly, as a reader, be making sure that I catch up with all the things that mean a lot to me. And if you want me to come down in person to Phillip Island next year to the festival, as long as you can get a passport or a visa, maybe a weekend visa, Chris, I'd be very happy to come down. So I want to thank everyone for listening tonight. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Tony. I think on a day when there was a Black Lives Matter protest in Sydney, it was wonderful to hear what you had to say. I will say, just very quickly, I don't want to take up too much time. My journey with this book, I got halfway through and I was actually quite distressed by what I learned about the lives of Sissy and Odette. and how their lives were controlled. And I rang Chris, and I told him I was quite upset. And he said, keep reading. It's actually a love story, you know, and it's about the grandmother and her granddaughter. And I persevered. And it, you know, it ended up really positively. But we don't learn this in schools about what their lives were like. And this is the history that's missing.
Yeah.
You know, it's white history, and it's not the truth.
Yeah. Look, I'll just say that, and I know we're running well out of time. People have been very patient. That, as I said earlier, I know that all of the writers I mentioned before, our work is being taught. And I know there are several schools across Australia that are already teaching the white girl. And I know the work of other writers that I've already mentioned tonight are being taught at schools. So we would hope that the knock-on effect of that storytelling and that education will really have a positive impact, and I think it will. So I think that, along with other aspects of what we might call our artistic production, because there are a lot of blackfellas working in other forms of the arts, I think we have great opportunities to engage people and to shift the consciousness of enough people who are fed up with narrow-minded stories. And this is not to say that, again, to your audience, that the stories of non-Aboriginal people aren't great. I mean, I read books by from people from all walks of life, different ethnicities. And what I want to say is we need to respect each other's stories, and we need to make sure, in this case, that First Nations stories are told and given autonomy and authority. So thank you very much, Lois.
Yeah, no, thank you, Tony. It's been absolutely wonderful. And thank you, Chris.
No problem.
I know you two have known each other for quite some time.
And you owes me $10, don't you, Chris? I'm gonna
always,
go now.
I think.
I'm going to go now before I get too cheeky. I always sort of can't help myself toward the end of a session, so I'll go now before I embarrass myself. Okay?
Okay, you can always catch a bus, Tony.
Yeah, and get arrested halfway down, Lois.
Okay. Okay.
See you later.
Thanks, Tony.
So I'd like to thank Chris and Tony. I think you will have all really enjoyed this evening. It's been absolutely fabulous. I'd also like to thank the Bass Coast Shire Council for their continuing support of our little projects. They've been absolutely wonderful. And just as a bit of a teaser, our next event is on the 27th of August. It's a Thursday night, and very soon we will be sending out some information on that, but I think you'll all be incredibly excited following on from tonight's conversation. So I'd like to thank you all, and we hope to see you very soon.
Thank you.